Welcome to the Daily Stoic Podcast, where each day we bring you a passage of ancient wisdom designed to help you find strength, insight, and wisdom in everyday life. Each one of these passages is based on the 2,000-year-old philosophy that has guided some of history's greatest men and women. For more, you can visit us at dailystoic.com. Hey everyone. Look, at the beginning of the year, I set out to think about how to improve my immune health. We're in the middle of a pandemic, as you know, and immune health is an important thing. I don't know about you, but I felt so much better the last 12 months not getting the flu or a cold the way I was getting them before. And that's why I'm excited about today's sponsor. Beekeepers Naturals has created a whole hive of products packed with immune-loving essentials so you can feel your best all day, every day. Beekeepers Naturals has great products like their propolis spray and their bee elixir. Bee propolis has natural germ-fighting abilities and antioxidants that protect our bodies. Their propolis spray is made with just 3 ingredients, no refined sugars, dyes, or dirty chemicals in this at all. And bee elixir helps you stay energized, on task, and focused all day long. It doesn't have any caffeine, so you don't get jitters, but it does have science-backed adaptogens that support clear thinking and a healthier brain. We've worked out an exclusive deal for Daily Stoic podcast listeners. Receive 15% off your first order. Just go to beekeepersnaturals.com/stoic or use the code STOIC at checkout. That's Beekeepers Naturals, BeekeepersNaturals.com/stoic. Check out their propolis spray and their bee elixir, and check out their other clean remedies that you and your family will love. Meet your new medicine cabinet with Beekeepers Naturals. You can also find Beekeepers Naturals nationwide in over 1,000 stores like Whole Foods and Sprouts. Hey, it's Ryan. What I wanted to do, in addition to sort of telling you the story of how the book came together, giving you a couple different reads of it for the audiobook, I wanted to really explain sort of the behind the scenes process with Vic Juhas, my wonderful collaborator on the art, which obviously listening to the audiobook you would not have seen, but I do hope you check out the physical version of the book because I think it itself is a work of art. I'm so proud of it. And Vic was an amazing collaborator to work with. He does sort of really funny stuff and really serious illustrations. He's appeared in every major publication you can think of. You may have seen some of his best work in Rolling Stone. Among the books he's also illustrated is D is for Democracy, A Citizen's Alphabet, G is for Gladiator, and R is for Rhyme. He lives with his wife in the New York Berkshires. Vic is an award-winning illustrator, a great guy, and you can see really understood deeply the material we were dealing with here in Marcus Aurelius. And I think you'll enjoy this discussion between two collaborators with a lot of respect for each other and how this book came together and what the Stoic characters meant to us and some of the decisions that went into the book that you've just listened to. So here is me talking with Vic Juhas. Hope you enjoy it. Well, I'm so happy like it exists. It's by the time people are listening to this, it will be well into a year of the process, but it feels amazing to me to sort of hold. I don't have the finished book in my hands, but I have the final page proofs, and it feels incredible to me that the thing that was just an idea in my head is now a real book, and you helped make that possible. I appreciate it so much.
My pleasure. It was an absolutely fascinating process, and I learned so much during it. And also, from my standpoint, it was such great fun to do, and it was one of those blessed experiences in an illustrator's life.
Well, the idea of it being somewhat blessed struck me in that afterwards and I guess maybe I should have done more of my research, but you came so highly recommended by our mutual friend, Sean Coyne, that, and I saw your drawings on your site and I was like, this guy can do it. But what was incredible to me was you sent me two, like last month, you sent me 2 children's books that you'd done about ancient Rome. I didn't even know you did that. What are the chances that you'd already studied this exact era and practiced?
Yeah, well, that was years ago. I did those one was on actually Greek mythology. Z is for Zeus. It was for Sleeping Bear Press. And the other one was G is for Gladiator, about the Romans, also for Sleeping Bear Press. And with both of those books, I did an awful lot of research. I think one of the great pleasures of being an illustrator and doing a book like this is the research time that I get to put in. I'd say 40% of the book is basically just looking up and reading and finding reference and just learning more.
Yeah, I was curious about that. So like when you let's say you set out to draw someone like Marcus Aurelius as a young boy, where and I know I gave you some pictures of my kid as a loose inspiration, but like when you go to like, hey, I want to get the essence of someone who's I'm trying to depict on the page, what do you look for?
I would think that most important for me is getting that as much factual reference as I can before I start interpreting the factual reference. Now, of course, we have those statues of Marcus Aurelius. I think we even have a painting or two, but I do know that we have statues, and actually I found something on Google, and God bless Google for all this access to information. I found one sculpting of him attributed to him as a young man, a young boy.
Right.
So I said, okay, good. So now I can jump back and forth. As it turns out, I found his face very interesting and aged it appropriately to the older Marcus Aurelius statues. And from that point, it was a matter of just staying faithful to the sketches, the drawings that I had created, so that we didn't veer off too far. I think during the process of sending sketches back and forth with you, it became apparent that I had to kind of pay attention to some of the details and not make Marcus Aurelius this Zelig kind of character look in all sorts of different ways.
What did you find so interesting about his face? That's a curious statement.
There was a certain sadness in that an older soul. Let's not call it sadness. Let's call it an older soul characteristic in the sculpting of him as a young boy. And then, of course, you look at the older portrait sculptings of him, and he has definitely become a wise adult.
Yeah, you're right. I'm looking at this statue. There is kind of there is a sadness to it. I mean, it's partly because I've got to imagine it's partly because the eyes are missing. But if you think about what that must have been like, you're this kid. If you're the prince, I'm watching the Queen right now. If you're the Prince of Wales, you're born knowing you're the Prince of Wales, and there's a tradition and there's a sort of a burden almost from birth. It must, my son's 4. I imagine, okay, let's say he's 9 or 10 years old. Imagine he just, comes home from school one day and he's been informed by the Emperor of Rome that he's going to be the next emperor. I mean, that would have been an incredible burden to place on a child.
In any era,
Yeah.
And especially in an era where the average lifespan, that was one of the other parts of the research, the average lifespan for a Roman was somewhere around 35 years old.
Well, yeah, I mean, even not to flash forward too much, but even Marcus Aurelius's life, I think he loses between 6 children. He has 6 children not make it to adulthood. And you're just like, death obviously would have just been everywhere. So there's probably a number of explanations for the sadness that you're picking up on in that statue.
And also, the reference that you had sent me, and then which then became my personal rabbit holes of finding out more information about him regarding his seriousness. He was a serious kid. He wasn't like Lucius, who was apparently more gregarious and a much more enjoyable personality to be around. I believe Marcus slept as a young boy on a very hard bed so as not to get himself too comfortable.
Yeah, he did. I think if obviously so much of this is projection, but that's what we do as artists. But it's interesting to think like so he's showing at an early age this proclivity, this affinity for philosophy. And he's as you said, he's sleeping on a hard mattress, he's reading these books, he's very studious. This is from what we know before he's chosen to be emperor. So who does that? It's an introverted, quiet, kind of intellectual kid. So to then be chosen for what is not just a public position, but at that time, the most public position, it must have been, it must have been such a difficult thing. And that's why, we start the book with the idea of like, he doesn't want this. So many kids like, when I grow up, I want to be president. We think that that's the norm, but a bunch of kids, to many kids, if you said that, that would sound horrible. They would be, they wouldn't want that at all.
It's probably true, especially nowadays.
Yeah. So you pick up on a sadness. What else strikes you about the art about Marcus Aurelius as you're trying to sort of capture this essence of a person?
Not a robust looking kid. As a matter of fact, my early sketches for you did not really portray a robust child. The more I read about him, compared to Lucius, he was not. And he had apparently a fair amount of health problems as he got older. So I didn't want to make him too. I didn't want this to be like a comic book in a sense, like a superhero kind of story. This I was trying to push as much as possible a more accessible human angle to the drawings.
I love that, and I think I picked up on it for the same reason. Because so again, it's like there's only one person who's born the son of a king or of a queen, right? It's in one sense, it's completely impossible to relate to. That doesn't happen to the vast majority of human beings. What's so surreal but also accessible, I think, about Marcus's story is he was just a regular kid. I mean, he comes from a good family, and clearly he was in the right circles. I mean, how do you even meet the emperor of Rome? But at the same time, he's this is much closer to almost something out of a fairy tale or a what is that, an Horatio Alger story where the ordinary boy is selected for extraordinary things.
Right. And as we follow the progression of the story, when you first sent me the manuscript and I was reading through it, and I kind of dashed off a number of ideas to you when we were just in the talking process. I don't even know if I had been selected to actually do the book yet, but I dashed off a bunch of ideas to you, and they were of a much lighter vein, stylistically as well as content-wise. And then once we really got into the book, the next challenge that I saw happening was as the book evolves, as your story evolves, the story becomes far more serious. And suddenly, where I started off, maybe in a more humorous, whimsical manner with the drawings, I had to start adjusting the drawings to complement and echo that growing seriousness that's going on in the story itself. So even though this is technically a children's book, this is actually also a book that adults can read.
Yeah, I see it less of a children's book and more as a fable or as a parable, and parables are accessible to all ages.
Yes.
But you're right. I mean, it's a serious story in that leadership is a serious thing, and those of us who are selected to it, on the one hand, look, like art is fun and spontaneous, as you know, and you're into it because you're passionate about it and all those things. But you also realize, like, it's not that it's a burden, but that it's serious. You know what I mean? That there's sort of obligations and responsibilities attached to it that you sort of have to come to terms with, and that's sort of always been my reading of the story. People think it would be so fun to be the emperor, and it's probably fun if you're a bad one, but to do it well is extraordinarily difficult, and just think of the weight that you have to carry.
Well, the only proof we have in terms of modern times is just to look at how rapidly a leader ages.
Oh, right. Yeah, those pictures of Obama, when he gets elected in 2008, and then when he leaves office in 2016, you watch you watch him go from black hair to almost solid gray hair.
Yeah, I can't think of one leader who has not left office and not looked like they've been through a storm.
Well, they have been through a storm, and not to flash forward too much, but Marcus Aurelius, of all leaders, gets hit with storm after storm after storm. Cassius Dio says, for all of his talent and brilliance, he's not met with the luck that he deserves. Right? Marcus Aurelius is sickly, as you said. Then there's the Antonine Plague. Then there's a coup. Then there's wars at the border. It's again, I think everyone thinks like, oh, it would be fun to be president. And then you look at the crises that are, that define every presidency or emperor. You're like, whoa, you didn't just go through one storm. It was storm after storm after storm.
Right. And I just can't imagine that kind of existence. I think you and I, in our own respective fields as artists, we deal with the daily challenges, the daily obstacles in front of us to produce, to create, and we have those resistances and on a daily basis, and those distractions that we have to kind of put out of the way. By the way, the Daily Stoic has been since we hooked up on this project, that the Daily Stoic has become like my morning Bible reading.
I love that.
So.
Got a quick message from one of our sponsors, and then we'll get right back to the show. Stay tuned. I can't believe it was 10 years ago now that I met the person who is the sponsor of today's podcast, the one and only Lewis Howes. Lewis Howes is the host of the School of Greatness podcast. He's interviewed some of the most successful people on the planet to find out what makes them tick and what you can learn from them, including Kobe Bryant, Brene Brown, Tony Robbins, Robert Greene. I actually helped put Robert Greene on the first episode, and Tim Ferriss, and so many more. Lewis's story is great. He was a professional football player. He washed up on his sister's couch, basically with nothing in his pocket, turned his life around, became an entrepreneur, great writer, built this great podcast. I was actually lucky enough to help Lewis on his 2 books, The School of Greatness and The Mask of Masculinity. I think you'll like this podcast. Go listen to The School of Greatness. It's an amazing show. You can listen to both of my episodes. I did it for The Obstacles Away, as well as Ego is the Enemy. Lewis is just a sweet guy. He asks great questions, the kind of questions you would want to ask if you were sitting across from these people. And he genuinely seems to want to help people. So subscribe to The School of Greatness on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or visit lewishowes.com/podcast. Well, no, I think people think it would be fun, but they don't. So people don't often people are often attracted to power or something because they think they're going to be able to wield it. It's going to give them what they want. I think Marcus is a bit of a cautionary tale in the sense of like, no, he was reluctant because he knew what it was going to take out of him. So like, it's funny, on the extreme end of the spectrum of the Stoics, you have Marcus Aurelius on one end, extreme power and privilege. You have Epictetus on the other, sort of extreme powerlessness. He's a slave, adversity, difficulty. But they're kind of both very similar souls in that they understand that, they've been dealt a hand by fate that people think is one thing, but is actually much more complex. And they're, I think they're aware of the burdens, but also they're just aware that, hey, look, life deals you a hand, and you got to figure out how to play it.
Right. I was also I found myself very intrigued by Junius Rusticus as well, and definitely wanted to create a character based on whatever reference we were able to find, and I believe there is one statue of him that maybe him, maybe not. I mean, there's no real way to tell. I mean, but it's attributed to him.
Yes.
And so I think that was the one that I told you. I said he looks like Roger Waters more than anybody else. He has that kind of long nose and chiseled out features according to the statue. So I kind of wanted to model Rusticus in a Roger Waters kind of way.
Well, Rusticus, of all of the characters in the book, is the most emphatically a character, in the sense of Marcus Aurelius is real. Most of what is said or done in the book is either something he learned or something directly from the Stoic philosophy. I wanted, the real story of Marcus Aurelius's life is unfortunately much more tragic and complicated than we do in the fable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Aurelius loses his father at a very young age. He's raised in part by his two grandfathers. Then Hadrian sees potential in him. Hadrian selects him to be the emperor, but Marcus is just a boy, and he realizes how insane it would be to put a boy in charge of the empire. So he adopts Antoninus Pius, who in turn adopts Marcus Aurelius. And I suspect Hadrian thinks that Antoninus Pius is going to live for a few years, that he might lead until, Marcus is in his early 20s, and then Marcus takes over. In fact, I think Antoninus rules for like almost 2 decades. So Marcus has this extraordinary experience with like basically a third father or a fourth father, right? His actual father, his grandfather's Hadrian, then Antoninus Pius. So that was just way too complicated. And frankly, because I did want kids to read the book, I didn't want to talk to my own son just yet about, that your father can die, and then your stepfather can die, and then your other stepfather dies. That was a bit much. So I decided instead to sort of focus all of that sort of paternal mentor energy into kind of an Obi-Wan, guide, educator, mentor character, which I call Rusticus. In reality, I don't think Marcus meets Rusticus until he's like 25. But so for people listening, Rusticus is a composite character of many influences in Marcus's life.
Right.
So when you're trying to project, when you're trying to, so Marcus, you can look at all these different statues and sort of get to the bottom of it. How do you decide to render Rusticus as you do?
I wanted to create a character that looked like he had a great deal of experience and information and wisdom to impart on Marcus Aurelius. And that became a matter of, like I said, I used Roger Waters as a guide, and that one sculpting that was found in reference. And then he became like this. He becomes like this foil, in a sense, to Marcus's acting out, and he comes in. If this was a movie, he comes in at the right time to kind of talk him off the ledge, or to get him to refocus, or do something to get back on course. And so he pops in and out, and at the same time, those those scenes that I was setting up between him and Marcus, where they're having those conversations, where Marcus is not really on board with doing what he has to do, and Rusticus is very patiently telling him, sometimes emphatically, but still he's very patient, and he's like, you got to. This is not what you're meant to do in life. You've really got to get on the ball here and refocus.
Yeah, in the concept of the hero's journey, there's that sort of, you get the call to adventure. And to me, that's what Marcus being selected to become emperor is. And then you sort of struggle with it and you're not sure, and maybe you stumble a little bit. And then there's this sort of critical phase where I think Campbell says, you meet the mentor. And the meeting of the mentor is such a critical breakthrough. And to me, that's what Rusticus is. He's the sort of the guide that helps Marcus realize that potential. And again, in reality, it was Antoninus Pius does this the most. Like when you read Meditations, the longest sort of page of thanks is to Antoninus, although Rusticus gets quite a bit too. But he could not have become who he became without this mentor.
Exactly.
What's so funny though is so you just have to find the mentor. But, and I tell this story loosely in Lives of the Stoics, but Seneca and, Nero is not born to be emperor either. His mother marries the emperor, and then she sort of, helps him eliminate his rivals and sort of jostles. So eventually Nero is in line. But Nero meets Seneca, the one of the greatest, wisest Stoics, roughly the same age, a few years different, a few years earlier even.
Mm-hmm.
Then Marcus meets Rusticus in real life. And yet the two emperors could not have turned out differently. So, there's that expression, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. But the reality is Nero probably has a better teacher than Marcus has in Rusticus, but you get a very different result because ultimately it's about, what is the student willing to do?
Well, yeah. I think one of the things that we realized as we were art students was that it didn't really necessarily matter what school you went to. It was great to go to a very good art school, but it was what you brought to it. I mean, if you were not there in the spirit of wanting to do something with it, you could have gone to the best school in the world and not produced, and not come out of it.
Right. You gotta do as Rusticus says in the books, like, it's not going to be easy. I can show you the way,
right,
but sort of you got to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is good. Which is what we hope to. We've imparted on, you're a young father still, but I had hoped that I was imparting to my son, and maybe I didn't impart it in the most subtle ways at times, but the intention was whatever successes, and I'm going to harass you in a sense, but but in the long run, if you succeed, it's because you followed through on it, not me. I didn't do your homework. You did.
Yeah, that's right. I can show you how to do it, but ultimately you have to do it. One of the things that we do know happened, again, it was at a different age, but we have the scene where Rusticus gives Marcus this stack of books. One of the things that I think is so incredible, just because it feels so modern, is that, and Marcus thanks him at the beginning of Meditations for this. Rusticus is the one who introduces Marcus to Epictetus. And Marcus says, thank you to Rusticus for loaning me his copy of Epictetus directly from his own library. And we actually get the sense, because Epictetus didn't publish anything, that this may not have been a copy of Epictetus. This may have been Rusticus's own notes. Like Rusticus himself may have met Epictetus. And I just think that's so incredible that here you have a slave influencing the most powerful man in the world through only a singular intermediary. And I just love the idea that it's like this guy changed his student's life by recommending a book, because that's happened to all of us.
All of us. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think all of us can thank certain people in our lives who saw something in us that maybe at the time we didn't see, obvious, or more certainly at the time we didn't see ourselves, but they pushed us, they kicked us in the ass, maybe, you could say.
No, totally. And I think that's a tricky thing with kids too. And this is why I wanted to do the book, is that like there are a lot of very entertaining kids books. There's a lot of very funny kids books. Where I think it struggles is sort of entertaining, well done books that are also in any way educational.
Right. Did you have any books that you were modeling it on?
Well, I like The Boy, the Fox, the Mole, and the Horse. I think I'm probably got them in the wrong order, but that's a good one. It feels that book feels a lot more for adults than it feels for kids. I think it's a great book. It's clearly sold extremely well because it's resonating on both levels. But the big model for me, and this is why I wanted to talk to you about it, was The Little Prince, because you have this sort of fantastical, surreal kind of adventure story for kids that's also operating on this totally different level for adults. And your son worked on the Netflix version of The Little Prince. So that when you told me that, the whole thing felt very faded. And I didn't even know that you'd done 2 kids books about Rome and Greece. So if I'd known then, I think we would have worked together even faster.
Well, just as well that you didn't know it right then and there. That it forced me to kind of present myself without the advance information.
But your son did work on that, right?
Well, yes. My son Alex was supervising the stop motion portion of that animated movie. Yes.
Did you expect your kids to sort of follow in the family business? Was that something you wanted, or did it surprise you, or did you sense that was the direction from the beginning?
Well, I have 3 sons, and I never have worked anywhere else but in the home. So I've never gone to work someplace. I mean, going to work was going to the 3rd floor, or basically going to the 3rd floor and into the studio. So I was always a presence in the house. I think in so many respects, what they saw was somebody who was working a lot, sometimes oftentimes under a lot of pressure,
deadlines and such.
Deadlines, but also not necessarily doing work that you wanted to do. You were doing work. Certainly, in the early part of my career, I was doing a lot of work to get known, to pay the bills, to keep a family functioning, and so they saw that it was not always a lot of fun. I think there's another fantasy about artists that it's just great, free flowing, wonderful kind of energy, and a lot of times it's work, and it's work that you may not necessarily find all that much fun. As I was going on in my career, I kind of made a deal with myself, or justified the work that I didn't want to do but was paying the bills with those that percentage of assignments that came in that were much more satisfying, and that kind of balanced it off. It made the process more amenable.
Got a quick message from one of our sponsors, and then we'll get right back to the show. Stay tuned. Hey everyone, look, I work out, try to eat right, I try to stay in shape, but one of the hardest parts about staying in shape is like, how do you measure that, right? And a lot of the measurements we use are not perfect, and they can lead to all sorts of other body issues. They can become obsessions, whatever. Tracking your weight is a really bad way to know whether you're healthy or not. And that's where today's sponsor comes in, FitTrack. FitTrack isn't about measuring weight, it's about measuring health. And their Dara Smart Scale measures 17 vital health metrics, including BMI, hydration level, muscle mass, and more. and the Dara Smart Scale accurately assesses each person's unique body type and gives you the information you need to get the results you want. I have a Fit Track in my closet. My wife and I both use it. There's even a cool Fit Track app that's free, measures all your data. You can have up to 8 users on the scale. Fit Track helps turn habits and goals into real results, and you can compare your progress as you're making it, and you can stay motivated and accountable. There's all sorts of great different measurements. And again, weight is so preposterously simple as a metric as to be almost worthless. So stop measuring weight and start measuring health with FitTrack. Go to fittrack.com/stoic to take 50% off your order. Plus, for a limited time, you'll also save an additional 30% with code BUILD30 at checkout. That's fittrack.com, fittrack.com/stoic to save 50% off. Plus, get an additional 30% off your order with code BUILD30 at checkout. Don't miss this limited time offer. fittrack.com/stoic, code BUILD30 at checkout. But as you've talked to your son, as he wanted to get it, and I don't know what your other two sons do, but as this one was pursuing an artistic career, what was your sort of rusticus advice as far as sort of pursuing that call?
Alex, it was just being on his back, just to follow through. He had more than one rusticus in that situation. He kind of drove several of his instructors at School of Visual Arts kind of crazy because Alex was and still is incredibly charming, and at the same time, there was a tendency on his part to let that charm cover a lack of follow through.
Interesting.
As he got older, and I think once he went on his own journey, once he left the East Coast and went to the West Coast, his story really picks up where he leaves all his he leaves those common temptations behind, the easy things that we can always fall back onto to distract us. And he grew exponentially once he came out to California and started working on animations out there.
Well, that's sort of a lesson in the book too, that the sort of Stoic discipline. Like one of the, I think, again, people have this fantasy, whether it's being an emperor or an artist, you're like, oh, I work for myself. I get to do whatever I want. In reality, when you work for yourself, you almost have the fewest choices because so much is riding on you, and what the right thing is so obvious, and you just sort of have to do it. Yeah, and it's on you. If you fail, it's in a sense it's on you. If you succeed, you take a bow, But let's see. Yeah, the ability to rule oneself. Like, it's like, okay, if you have a regular job, you have to get there at a certain time, which means you have to leave your house at a certain time. And then you have these prescribed breaks. And then here's the sort of rhythm of the office. And here's when they do meetings. And here's when this and blah, 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 blah. Right. But when you work for yourself, now you have to impose all that structure. And so, sure, there's not a tyrant telling you what to do, but you have to be the tyrant now, or else there's just chaos. And so there's this sort of self-imposed discipline is almost a harder discipline because you could get away with not doing it, but then you also know you'd get stuck with the consequences if you don't. And so I tend to find being self-driven is a little bit exhausting. I don't know why, more so than anything else, but there's a kind of you're just tired. Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I think there's something almost fearsome about imposing the discipline within yourself to get things done. There is something, I think, very comforting about going someplace where the format is laid out for you, like you were describing. When you are creating your own format, and you have to get up in the morning and you have to get through the initial exercises of the day, be it the physical exercises, mental exercises, meditation,
jogging, whatever. And I can't say that I'm the most strict follower of those, especially when it comes to exercise. But getting into a program is important, even if, especially if you hate it every day and you're just doing it because you got to do it.
Well, I wonder if part of why it's so fearsome or exhausting is also like, okay, so let's say you work at a company, there's kind of a ceiling, right? It's like, this is how many widgets you're supposed to sell. This is, what your salary is, blah, blah, blah. But then when you're a freelancer, you're doing your own thing, it's unlimited, which is good in one sense, but it makes it hard to not do it. Do you know what I mean? Like it's like, you can always do more. And so that's sort of looming over you. And you're like, well, this offer came in to do X. I feel guilty if I turn it down. I feel, there's just the discipline never has an end, as opposed to like, I put in my 8 hours, I'm good to go.
Yeah. And at the same time, you've focused on that in the Daily Stoic, that you have to learn how to say no at certain points. Mm-hmm. You have to protect yourself. You're not doing yourself a favor by just functioning in a constant forward motion. There has to be time to pull back and reflect and not be in that work mode all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where the stillness comes in. And I think for me, that's what Meditations clearly was for Marcus. That was a guy who had an unlimited amount of work, who was always dealing with something, sort of carving out a little time for himself. And, Brand Blanchard calls it in the midnight dimness. He sat down with his journal. And I think that's what he was doing. And I think that's why it resonates with all of us, because we've been at that place that he clearly is coming from in the writing.
It'll be curious what kind of impact you have on your own kids, that how they'll pick up on your work ethic. I know with my eldest son, he's always wanted to be an entrepreneur. He never wanted to work, quote, for somebody else on that, quote, 9 to 5 basis. And that was, as time went on and we would talk, he would say that was just watching me was one of those motivating factors to do that in his own life, to be his own boss.
Yeah, that's right. And I think probably being like growing up, I don't remember really seeing or meeting hardly anyone who didn't have a job. Sacramento, where I grew up, was a government town, and everyone else had a job. They worked at a company. Intel was there. There was a few big tech companies too. But the point was, almost everyone had a job. So it wasn't like San Francisco, where you're like, oh, this person started this company. It was this person. It wasn't like, hey, this person started Twitter. It was like, oh, this guy works at Intel. And so I think I got to imagine watching your dad, as your boys were able to do, watching you work for yourself and not just be really good at it, like the craft of it, but to be successful at it, to make a living at it, not be a starving artist. There's probably something empowering in that. I've talked about this with some athletes too. It's like, it's not that just that their dad or their mom passed on, superior genes that made them tall. Mm-hmm. It's that, Steph Curry grew up in basketball arenas watching his dad play basketball as a professional athlete. Mm-hmm. That probably made the NBA seem a lot less intimidating and a lot more real to him than it would have been to your average kid with the same height and the same skills. Steph Curry just had an advantage. There wasn't a mystique about it.
Right. Interesting observation. I don't think I've ever thought of it that way.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about another relationship in the book, because it's one I've been endlessly fascinated with. The relationship between Marcus and Lucius, because they're not technically brothers, although Marcus refers to him as his brother in meditations and in his letters. So he clearly had a great deal of affection for him. But, we know what a king is supposed to do when there is a rival to the throne of, an illegitimate rival or of a different bloodline. Even in the Stoic history, Octavian, who's advised by his Stoic teachers to eliminate Julius Caesar's son with Cleopatra. So there is being a king is a bloody effed up thing, right? And yet Marcus has a totally the opposite relationship with his brother. It's really incredible.
Yeah, and then as we get on in the book, I mean, they combine at several points in the book, so that they're the scene where they're practicing wrestling, and Lucius is obviously stronger. The scenes where Marcus is not happy with the fate that he's been handed in terms of becoming the emperor, but Lucius is kind of pissed off because it's like, why is he getting all the pomp and circumstances and all the special treatment? And so that scene where their mom comes in and says, "I don't want to hear either one of you complaining,"
Yes. So, yeah, no, it's strange because they must have, sometimes opposites get along very well, but I've got to imagine their personality types were so different that it almost makes it more impressive that they were able to get along and weren't openly antagonistic towards each other. Like these were, if you were describing them on paper, you have this sort of austere philosopher who believes that being emperor is a burden, but that Stoicism obligates you to do this and this, and he feels this intense connection to the public good. And then you describe Lucius, who's this sort of maybe a bit of a drinker, and he's fun, and he's much more gregarious and personable. Isn't actually selected for the throne the way that Marcus is. You would not think that they would then work well together, but by all accounts, they did.
Interesting, because didn't Lucius was not in reality such a great manager, right?
Well, they sort of split, from what I understand, they sort of split their roles, and Lucius sort of takes care of the army and is away from Rome for large chunks. He ends up dying, I think, midway through Marcus's reign. But there's no accounts of them fighting with each other, plotting against each other, trying to hurt each other. I remember actually one of the last. Let's talk about that, because I remember one of the last notes that I gave to you. I thought the book was really good. I thought we were basically done, and I said, "Vic, I'm so sorry. I have a last minute change," which is that I really noticed on the page where Lucius. Where Marcus names Lucius co-emperor, spoiler alert, but I felt like the faces on the people observing this weren't stunned enough, because it's totally without precedent in all of human history. I mean, imagine, again, I'm watching The Queen right now, so it's top of mind, but imagine if when Queen Elizabeth becomes queen, her father dies, she was just like, "Oh yeah, I'm not going to be queen, I'm going to be co-queen, and Princess Margaret is going to take half of the burdens." Like, people would be stunned. That's not. We know that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Nobody willingly gives half of it away, and so I really wanted just the stunningness, the incredibleness of that to be conveyed, because it's almost unbelievable.
Yeah. I hope I pulled that off on the revise. I know I changed a number of the expressions, but since it was already the crowning, I think my comment to you back then was like, okay, so let's not make it look like everybody just walked in and this is happening.
Of course.
but we will show some amazement at this unique event, this unique kind of crowning.
Yeah, I mean, even, right, it's not like there's a ceremony, right? There's a ceremony for when someone becomes emperor. What ceremony is there when you become co-emperor? It never happened. And I don't think it ever happened again.
I'm not sure, but now you got me a little confused. Was it Lucius who went off to fight the wars?
Well, Marcus did several, but I think almost all of the entirety of their reign was defined by wars of some form or another, which is kind of just the reality of Roman history, to be honest. But just the idea of sharing power, I just found to be so incredible. And there was a line in a much, much earlier version of the book, I don't know if you saw it, but which I basically have Marcus saying something like, the job is big enough, is bigger than one person, and the more help you can get, the better. And I wanted to sort of capture, because there's something in Marcus's meditations where he talks about not being afraid to ask for help. And I think there's something about that too. It's not just the lack of ego. It's not just the willingness to share, but it's also maybe this sense that Marcus knew there were not deficiencies in his personality, but that he could use an extra pair of hands. And I think as a moral lesson, that's an interesting part of the idea. Because when I keep saying there's no precedent, the interesting part is there actually is a precedent in Roman history. There was no president when Rome was a republic, there was no singular head. There was two consuls. So in Roman sort of democratic history, the idea always was there was not one single person in charge. And when that happened, that was called a dictator.
Mm-hmm.
And it was for emergencies. But that power was meant to be shared, and that it was actually less dangerous when it was shared. It's just that was the system. So for Marcus to do it voluntarily is again, unprecedented.
Yeah. And an incredible bit of wisdom on his part, that he realized that there were strengths that Lucius could bring into it.
Yes,
and that he had his own strengths. If I'm correct, the indigenous Americans, they had like the sachem. You had a sachem chief, a peacetime chief, but you also had a war chief too. And they kind of, depending on the circumstances of the time, one would take over, or one would become predominant during a particular period of time. If there was a war going on with another tribe, then the war chief would basically be running the show.
Got a quick message from one of our sponsors, and then we'll get right back to the show. Stay tuned. Hey, as you know, I recommend a lot of books here on the podcast, and part of the reason I read so much is that it's my job, but I also understand that not everyone has quite as much time to read as I do. So if you are someone who wants to read, or you've been intimidated by some of the books I've recommended, Blinkist, today's sponsor, might just be for you. Blinkist finds the most important takeaways from the best nonfiction books around, then it condenses that into a summary you can read or listen to anywhere on your phone, tablet, or laptop in just 15 minutes or less. You absorb all the key lessons, you get the main points, you understand what the book is actually about, what the author's actually trying to say, and they've got all the most important nonfiction books you can imagine, books like Sapiens. They even have my newest book, Lives of the Stoics, so if you've been meaning to check that out, you can do that too. Blinkist is great. I have no problems with book summaries. In fact, if it helps you be a better reader, I'm all for it. So with Blinkist, you get unlimited access to read or listen to a massive library of condensed nonfiction books. Plus, they've got a good podcast. Right now, they have a special offer just for the Daily Stoic audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Stoic, and you get it free for 7 days, and then you save 25% off your new subscription. Just go to Blinkist, Blinkist.com/Stoic, 7 days for free, plus 25% off when you sign up. Well, so one other thing on Marcus and Lucius, which I think is interesting, is there's some precedent for it in Roman history, at least in the Stoics. You have this person who's sort of very strict with themselves. Marcus is very strict with himself, but he says in Meditations, he says tolerant with others, strict with himself.
And I love that line.
I think that encapsulates his relationship with Lucius, where it's like Marcus is like, here's my standard. Here's who I am. but I'm going to love my brother anyway. And there's a story. Cato is famously very, very strict with himself, but he had a brother, and he loved his brother so much, even though his brother, was what his brother, wore perfume and fancy clothes and was much more, again, outgoing and ambitious. And I when I wrote about him in Lives of the Stoics, I quote that great line from Springsteen where he says, "Sometimes when it's your brother, you look the other way."
Right.
And I think that's what Marcus does with Lucius.
Yeah. An interesting relationship, and it certainly inspires me to continue reading about that period of time. I'm a big history buff anyway, so I've got just more material now that I've to explore. But I love this because it passes on to the kids. I can't wait for the grandkids to be getting copies of this and to give it to friends who've children and stuff like that. And also just to give it pass it around. It's I think it's going to look beautiful. And the last time I saw the proofs, I think we have a gorgeous book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think one other thing I was going to say about Lucius and Marcus that's interesting too is, the big sort of historical question about Marcus is, well, why is his own son so troublesome? Why does it not work for Commodus? And anyone who's seen the movie Gladiator sort of knows how the story ends. But it's also a big historical what if, because from what I understand, Marcus's original plan was that one of his sons and one of Lucius's sons would rule as co-emperors afterwards. So his thinking was nobody should be all powerful. Power should be shared. And then when Lucius either doesn't have a son or his son passes, Marcus thinks, well, then two of my sons are going to share it.
Mm-hmm.
And then that fails to come to pass, again, because of tragedy. So I think Marcus clearly had this idea that power was best shared and not wielded unilaterally.
Right.
And then he ends up being proven right. He's the exception that proves that rule.
Yep. And I do believe that Commodus kind of broke his heart in terms of what he was developing into.
I suspect so. It's probably the final mercy of Marcus's life is that he doesn't know what happens to his son. He doesn't know how bad it gets.
Right. Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, I think the sort of conclusion of the book, it sort of concludes with the idea of the four virtues and the idea that, again, this is a parable of leadership. This isn't the one-off fantastical, story of one boy chosen to be emperor. To me, this is the what happens to all of us. We're all chosen for something, whether it's art or writing or film or entrepreneurship or politics or public service. We're all chosen for something. And in some respects, that's a burden, but it's also an opportunity because it allows us to become who we can be. And it calls from us, courage and justice and wisdom and discipline.
Yep. Yes, sir. Absolutely correct.
What do you what do you think? Is there anything in Marcus's story that you didn't quite get to capture, or that you're still musing on? Any sort of questions that you're left with? I'm just curious about anything we haven't talked about.
I'm kind of fascinated by the relationship he had with his mother. I get the impression he loved his mother dearly,
mm-hmm.
and but at least the way we portray her in the book, she's also not. She's not a mushy kind of mother. She's got that sense of the responsibility too, of what he's got to assume. So consequently, she's another kind of Obi-Wan in pulling him back to reality.
Yes, yeah, no, that's really important. I mean, there are these sort of adopted paternal influences in Marcus's life, but I've got to imagine that the absence of his father, losing his father early, it must have, he could not have become who he was without a strong maternal presence as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
The scene where he's kind of like, are we revealing anything?
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
The scene where he's being very mischievous and disrupts a shepherd's flock. And,
Which that's a real story, although I think it happened when he was much older.
okay. And he returns home and mom's waiting for him at the gate. Like, I thought that was kind of charming that we were able to include that and set it up that way.
Well, no, and I think that probably jives with a lot of people's experiences where it's like dad would be angry, but mom would be disappointed. And that was probably worse.
Yes. Yes. It's so funny. This is a side story, and it's not even relevant to what we're talking about. But you just made me think of something else, and I'm not going to say.
Okay, are you sure?
Yeah, because in when I was a kid, when I was in grade school, I got involved in doing something really stupid that somehow brought the cops into the picture, and I remember one of my friends, his father got the phone call from the cops, and the father went off on the police. And when my father got the call, I was watching him, and after he listened, said okay, and then he hung up the phone, and he looked so heartbroken, and he said, "Well, we'll just see what happens." And had he beaten me, I would have preferred to get the beating rather than seeing the expression on his face, and realizing that I had done something that had really saddened him, or really disappointed him. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that was a far worse punishment than getting a strap.
But no, and that's where that sort of virtue of discipline comes in, sort of in all senses of the word. The discipline that your father had not to give in to what also must have been anger or frustration and instead be restrained is far more powerful, and probably teaches you a lesson later with your own kids, but also just a lesson about your temper. How could your dad then ever, if your dad's losing his temper at you all the time, what moral authority does he have when you lose yours?
Funny thing
the
is,
restraint there says more.
Funny thing is, he did lose his temper all the time, and this was like one of the only times that I could remember where he didn't. I was so expectant, and it was the absolute opposite response.
That's funny. Yeah, I was gonna say when you're bringing up Marcus's mother, that's one story I remember, which is that apparently so we tell the story about Marcus not wanting to be emperor, and he sort of has this dream that makes him think he can do it. Also a real part. But apparently as a young boy, and this strikes me as so sweet. And I don't know what age this happened at, but apparently one of Marcus's main reservations about being selected for this was that he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to have to move out of his house with his mother, and move to the palace. He wanted to be able to stay with her. And I just find that such a revealing, if true, such a revealing insight into what a sort of a softy he must have been underneath.
Yeah. Just think of him as emperor. I think it was every year that he was emperor, there was, like you mentioned before, there was some sort of war going on. What a conflict that must have been. How so against his internal grain that must have been to constantly be in a state of defense or offense.
Totally. I mean, he spends at one point, I think, 8 years away from Rome. And so imagine, he's missing his family, he's missing his kids, he's missing his books, he's missing his routine. This wasn't the job he wanted. And it's not like, oh, hey, I don't want to be president, but I was elected president and I have to serve for 4 or 8 years. Mm-hmm. It's like, it was the job he didn't want. And it's the job you can only stop doing when you die. I mean, it was a tragic gift.
Yeah. And how one can only imagine what will it took for him to keep pushing on every day.
Well, and the line we have, you mentioned it, where the mother says, never be heard complaining, not even to yourself. Marcus writes that in Meditations to himself. So we know he didn't want to be emperor. And he says, never let yourself be overheard complaining at court, not even to yourself.
Right.
So there must have been a part, he's like, I don't want to do this. I just want to go home. But he sticks with it, and he doesn't even allow himself to whine about it.
I know.
It's beautiful.
So many lessons that will be of value from this book, and in that kind of condensed life history. So I'm looking forward to seeing it in print. When is it coming out, actually?
So when people are hearing this and when it will come out are different things, but just as interesting insight into the production process for people listening. So it went, one of the big things, so typically I traditionally publish all my books. So I send them the manuscript, and then that's sort of not my problem from there. And then this one I decided to self-publish. I wanted more sort of control over it. I wanted it to be on my own timeline. But then all of a sudden you're faced with all these decisions, right? Decisions that you didn't have to make before. I don't know what printer Penguin Random House uses, right? I don't know what they pay. I don't know the timelines of it. I know sometimes my books go out of print, but I don't know how that works. So that was actually a big decision we made on this one, was to print it in the US. So it went to the printer last week, and it should be here, I think, they said about 3.5 to 4 weeks. So we should have books here very shortly. And then people who are listening to this are either listening to the podcast, and then also this file is going to be attached to the audiobook. So we spent a bunch of time. I spent the last couple of weeks working up the audiobook. So I read it to my kids. I had 2 different narrators read it. We're going to do a version with sound effects, and then did sort of an explainer, like sort of how the book came to be. But by the way, a whole different experience.
A shout out to the kids who offered critiques of their own on the drawings that I was sending in.
Oh, my kids? Yeah, they definitely had feelings.
I really appreciated that, because that's always nice to get that kind of feedback, that kind of that very honest.
What is that?
Right. Mm-hmm.
No, that honestly, like one of the things I don't know your experiences with this, but one of the ways I found you maintain your sanity as a creative is that you want to define your success as much as possible. This is a very Stoic idea, within the bounds of what's up to you, like what's in your control. And so where I got on this project, and again, we're recording this before it's out, whether it sells 1,000 copies or 1,000,000 copies, whether it's a big success or, take a bath on it, it's already a huge victory for me in that I got to spend so much time with my kid. So much time with the material, which I'm fascinated with. But every night during the early months of the pandemic, I started just writing this on, just random sheets of paper, going over and over and over it with my kids, and them being involved in its evolution was just such a wonderful experience that I wouldn't trade anything for. Yeah. That, every copy that sells is just gravy, because like I already got that part was already worth it. And just the satisfaction of like, now it exists. Like I got to work with you, and I'm seeing my idea, illustrated in a way that I couldn't have done. But the experience was really the rewarding part, which is where you want to be, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have come on to this project with you.
Well, Sean Coyne has been a pivotal influence, not just in this project, but for people listening who are fans of my other book. Sean Coyne is partly the one who gave me the idea on Obstacle is the Way to split that book up into 3 parts, as I ended up doing. So that was a very lucky conversation and connection. And Vic, thank you so much. It was an honor to do this. I'm glad we recorded this episode as well.
Oh, and great.
Let's start thinking about the next one.
Absolutely. I'm game. I'm always game.
All right, man.
Thank you very much, sir.
What makes Marcus great are his teachers and the early influences in his life.
Rusticus, Antoninus Pius. I mean, the whole opening section of Meditations is him really acknowledging the people who were formative in helping him become the man that philosophy wanted him to become. And that's the story I tell in my new book, The Boy Who Would Be King. It's an illustrated fable about the early years of Marcus Aurelius, how this little boy was selected from obscurity and ruled the world and did so without being corrupted by it. He really did become the man that philosophy wanted him to be. And that book is now out. It's available everywhere. I've been working on this book for the last year. It came out of the pandemic for me, something I've wanted to do for a really long time. You can check it out. Go to dailystoic.com/king, or you can pick up The Boy Who Would Be King anywhere books are sold, including on Amazon. But if you buy it from us at dailystoic.com/king, you get the audiobook for free, which has me reading it and a bunch of other cool people. So check it out, The Boy Who Would Be King. And we should learn to lead like Marcus Aurelius, and we should try to not just make Stoicism proud, but we should try to make the example of Marcus Aurelius proud.